Hey everyone, I'm Noctis Corvus, but you can call me Noctis. This week we are keeping it simple, since I am working on a few things in the background and trying to work out how I would go about some certain things coming up. Naturally though, that is all talk for later, for another day. For now, I've had a situation and a story almost stuck in my head, as I don't really know where it came from. Yet that is what we're going to be looking at today with this drawing. So let's just get straight into it then, shall we? The first stage of this drawing had actually been a written story. After all, when the narrative first came to mind, I thought that it would work best as a short story, or simply just a note kept burrowed away somewhere for later reference in case I ever wanted to expand upon it. I wrote it down as a very brief and simple skeleton, you see, and just left it at that. I didn't add any scenes to it or focus much time on it, as I have had quite a few passing ideas that never quite go anywhere after all. I just kind of wrote what was in my head and that was it, and left it as simple scenes that were fragments of a story and these characters before moving on to the next idea before I lost that next idea. This happens almost way too often with ideas as well. Losing them, I mean. It's normally some sort of race against time to get them all down before I forget them, or before one takes priority and I go too far with it. I kind of figured that it would be the end of it, you see. But seeing as I am currently making this script and this art and I'm recording this audio, and you're here too, it's safe to say that it most certainly wasn't the end of anything, but only a beginning. See, the story kind of stayed even though I had written all I had for it. But I didn't want to expand it further. There was no way I could expand that story further. There really wasn't much that I could have done with it in a written format anymore, and believe me, I did try for quite a while to see if maybe that was what it wanted, if that was the way to go with it. I tried to expand it, but it just gave me ideas for elsewhere or other things that would work better written down, or held as a story in my head for later. Nothing, no matter which route I took with it, kept the core of this narrative, which I was fine with. I was okay with that. When it comes to writing, it's normal that the core of any idea may change the more it's explored or the further I take it. Yet normally it means that the core of the idea leaves my mind and I can look at the later sections of it alone as their own idea and their own thing, without really having to cling to the original start that it may have had. This time saw the core remain as a new idea was almost entirely different, and barely had a thread of that start in it anymore. I suppose in a way part of me just wanted to still explore this original idea and the start that it held. I then realised that this idea has been here now for quite some time too. In my sketchbook, I was flipping through it to get to a new page and everything, and I ended up noticing some old sketches that featured this idea almost identically to the one that I wrote about now. The only thing with those sketches is that I never developed them beyond a quick note that I figured I would return to later. I never did then go back into it in full detail though, and I only ever ended up borrowing ideas off of these sketches in later details and drawings. For example, I have a speed paint on the channel of a statue in a forest environment that I borrowed a lot from one of these sketches visually. The environment came from it and the statue idea came from it, but it still wasn't the sketch or the story that I originally looked at for it. I suppose all of this kind of meant that I figured that since this idea seems to be a repetitive one that I haven't noticed until now at the very least, I would explore it in full as an art and a narrative instead of a written version, just to see if maybe this will satisfy it, and to see if this is what I wanted to do with this idea all along. So then, what is this story I've spoken so much about yet never quite explained? Well, it's an idea of a person coming across a statue that looks a lot like them, and the potential reasons that may be for. Naturally, it developed as I drew this image, and came to these conclusions. Yet, that was the starting point for the sketches, and I had to work out who was coming across the statue, what the statue would be there for, and what would be the most likely way something would be read as. My first thought was for it to be a person coming across a statue that marks a grave in the middle of a forest or a field. I figured that I could toy with the environment to fit the atmosphere that I would need, and nothing would really stop me from putting it anywhere that it fit, or that I needed or wanted it to be. The key bit would be the person seeing the grave, or a grave, for what looks like themselves. It would have read a lot like a person is finding their own grave after passing, and would invite questions of whether they knew that they were dead or not, what their next move would be as well. It wasn't a bad idea, to be fair. I could make them obviously a ghost, whether it was just by making them somewhat transparent or something else that I didn't quite yet work out. Or I could have made them more human so that the viewer could make their own conclusions. Maybe it was reincarnation and the person just happens to look like the person in the statue in the grave. Or maybe it would be a ghost. Maybe it would be a mistaken grave and the person was never actually dead anyway. The point of it all is that I wasn't sure, and there could be many ways it would be read and many interesting pathways that I could take with it. I just didn't want to cement the idea too soon though, you see. These were all ideas that I may come back to later, but they were the earlier parts for this one that was set aside. The first idea could have been this week's video, yet I wanted to keep experimenting as the idea was still proving possible options, and was still providing things and avenues that I could investigate and wanted to investigate. The second route was entirely different, you see. Instead of looking at themes of mystery and the unknown, the story looked at celebrations and dedications as I drew more inspiration from the statues dotted around various places that are meant to commemorate people or times of the past. It was still in a fantasy tone, don't get me wrong there, but it read more as an adventurer who'd done something great for the area, looking at a statue as if in recollection, remembering that time of their lives and the deeds that they accomplished. This one also had multiple routes that I explored for a while too. The route I almost took was one of these ideas, actually, as I liked the idea of a statue that held multiple people on it, as if it was a group who did something together, yet only draw one of them looking at it, as if to raise questions about where the others are from on the statue. I really liked that this idea would have been read with many conclusions. The rest of them may have passed in the time between the deed and this drawing. It may have been a memorial statue to those who took whatever risk, with the minority making it back. It also could have been that this person is the only one there at the moment, as they wait for the others or go about their days now. Something entirely harmless, or something a bit darker depending on how the viewer would interpret it. Either way, I didn't yet settle on this idea in particular. Those sketches and ideas looked a little too close to something else I've seen lately, so I wanted to kind of let it sit for a while, maybe a couple of weeks, maybe some months, just until I could come up with it as my own ideas, and not have to worry so much about this issue of me seeing it somewhere and unconsciously replicating it. See, I know that with time that, yes, this idea may remain, but I won't have these images that I've seen recently as present in my mind, so I'd be more willing to move away from those layouts to look at something that I may have not seen before. Either way, I know I can do more with the ideas as and when without having to worry and having to hurry on it, so to speak. Instead, I took parts of it and began the other avenue, which ended up being this one that I would follow and that I wanted to explore in the end. So then, with a lot of build-up, we got this narrative. I wanted to look at a person coming across an older statue that resembles them in most ways minus a few. This one does have ties to the grave idea, but not so strictly a grave, you see. What the statue would depict exactly was still up in the air, and how much the person would resemble them too, I was still yet to see. But I liked the idea. I sketched a few ideas for it again, a few where the person was in various locations in relation to the statue as well. In one, they were sat at the statue's base and looked up at it. Another, they were behind the statue as if circling it in confusion for a better look, maybe as if they were examining the similarities between them both. In another, they were kneeling by the side of it, and that one read in a few ways on its own. In the end though, I liked this one the best. The person is subtle and by no means the main focal point. The eye is drawn to the statue first and then leads down to the environment and the person as part of that environment and the things around them. This version keeps it subtle, and the story is that little bit more open than anything before it. Anywhere else that I could have put the person kind of guided the story too much. this one doesn't do that. I started drawing this with one story in mind, and yet I found that it almost developed more and more the longer I created and worked on it. By this I mean that it started with one story, and then by the end of it, I alone could see maybe 3 or 4 ways that it could be interpreted. The main story I ended up working on was the idea of reincarnation. The statue is from a time long before the person's existence, and is dedicated to a being, maybe divine in origin, maybe not, who is now the same as the person in front of them without knowing. Though working on it, I also read the image as a human disguise of the divine that statue is dedicated to, as if they're now trying to keep a low profile and came across this statue somehow. Again though, working on it some more, I also interpreted it as a divine potentially not knowing their origin, not realising their capabilities, and going as human due to some sort of conflict in the background of it all. They come across this statue from long ago, or maybe something newer even, and there'd be a few questions that would then be worth asking. It's also safe to say that these aren't all of the ways it could be read. It really is part of the enjoyment in these drawings as they adapt and change the longer I work on them, so that the story isn't any single thing. Even when I create them, there's many answers to one question and a few details is all that it takes. For example, the main difference between the statue and the person is the lack of wings, which is enough to make some people question if they are meant to be the same person or not. They could be the same person, or the person in front of them just likes dressing like the statue, or it happened by coincidence and this is just a really common form of dress and appearance in this world. But this detail to others could also be what sways them towards one of the other interpretations that I've already covered before. It could be what cements them as the same person. Anyway, with the story established in any form, I had a sketch that I could actually start looking at in a bit more detail. I had ideas from the different story routes and ways that I could portray them so that I really could just get into it without worrying about how it would be read, or how it would come across. It may sound daft, especially after talking about the narrative for so long and the base idea, but when it came to creating the final sketch for it this time, I almost put the narrative to the side for a while and left it on a mental sort of shelf so that I could focus on how everything would look and how it would come together before anything else. I could prioritise just making something that looked good, with the themes that I'd picked out, and then almost worry about how it would be read later. As long as it was close to the story, or the story has at least one option for interpretation, then I would be happy. I mean, I have had it before where I have almost fixated on a single narrative at the sketching phase before, you see. It's likely that there is another video on the channel where I have done that, and maybe talked about it, or maybe I didn't. Either way, I tend to find that deciding on a single narrative and focusing only on that during the sketch often leads to a drawing that I'm not so happy with. I tried to make sure that the only way the situation would be viewed would be how I planned for it and how I intend it to be, which is just impossible. And then I never really like the sketch or the later stages, as the image then suffers for the fixation and the focus that I don't let myself look at the larger idea. It's that, or I try to include too much to make it way too obvious and clear, with the details that simply don't matter in the long run, and only end up cluttering everything. So I was going to avoid that this time. I made it look nice, made sure that the layout was something that I wanted, and then I sort of worried about the story and if it fit right. If it didn't, I would have started over with this one and then set this sketch aside for another time, as that would be if I liked the layout and could interpret a story that may not have been what I was aiming for but would be something interesting. But either way, I would still try again to see what would need changing for the story to come through. Of course, this time I didn't really have that as a problem, and the sketches from the before came together really well, but it would have been an option if it required it. With all of that said though, I had the sketch, and I will talk about specific details for it later on. For now though, I had to pick a colour palette, and I only had a single idea for what would be included. I mean, I had a lot of plants, and green would make sense for it. I also had a statue, so there would be quite a bit of grey if paired with the stone details and steps like the pillars. It really only left a little bit for me to consider, but I still wanted to see what it might end up looking like. I mean, maybe I'd decide later that blue worked better for the plants, or red and orange and made it look something different. So I definitely needed to test it at least. This is why, right at the start, I do what I will call a colour sketch, where I just sort of scribble on the layer below the sketch to get a feel for what it would look like once done and once I'd chosen these colours. I also added a vague idea of light and shadow over it, just to kind of get a feel for it all together, so I wouldn't end up disliking it later down the line or wanting to start over in a new palette from lack of planning. If I hated it later down the line even with doing this, then I would have, but I wouldn't have been able to blame lack of planning, just that I changed my mind. The point for this bit is that sketch and the colour version is messy, and it stays messy since I then start the flats once I'm done with it on a new layer. But the sketch is meant to be quick, and it kind of lets me mess around without committing too much to anything too soon. Usually I would do it off camera, yet I kept it in this time since it is almost funny to me sometimes, especially when I look at how different that colour mock-up would be compared to the final thing. Those layers are intended to be done quickly and then ignored almost once I have the palette set aside. I may only refer back to it if I want to check my lighting ideas, or if I simply forgot what colour goes where and I need to remind myself of my plans. This time though showed me that red was a good partner with this idea. I had green already, so wanted to use something warmer, especially to go with the warmer grey tones across it all that I had planned, and the reds went well with that in the background. I also knew that I'd have a lot of flames in the piece from the candles, so I kinda knew that orange and yellow would at least be somewhat present in it, so I also thought to tie these into it all as well, mainly the orange with the flowers in the end. When all was said and done though, with the palette and the details, it looked a lot like this design would have been tied to nature, or the natural world at the very least, which I didn't mind as it added to the story that little bit more, and I had already established a lot of these ties and the ideas in the sketching phases. Of course though, with the colours established, I could begin working with the flat colours and everything else, and actually get into the main bulk of this video. This stage ended up fairly straightforward, as did the later stages of shading and everything else with the finishing touches. The only real challenge was to make sure the details on the statue remained intact and together, as I just drew that all on one layer. I figured it made more sense to carve everything out of the shadows so that it would be a bit more natural. So with most of our time left though, let's discuss the details of the sketch that I chose to include in a bit more detail then, shall we? I've gone over the narrative at length and maybe things like where the person is located, but not many more of the appearances that I went with to portray these things. The first detail to go over naturally is going to be the statue. They are the focal point and the element of everything that is to be noticed first, as everything kind of refers back to it in some capacity. At first I wasn't exactly sure what to do for this one either. I know I settled on it being a statue that looked like the person in the piece, but I wasn't sure if the statue would be a singular person, the mystery being why they look so similar, minus maybe a few elements. Or if the statue would be a pair or a duo or a group. The mystery then being who the other figures would be and who the second figure was. Yet I did settle quite easily on this idea of a single one, to follow the divine idea and that route I wanted to look at. In terms of their design, I kind of just used an older sketch of this idea from some months ago. I had this drawing kind of just sat there with some other and similar motifs that I kind of wanted to look at again, and it made sense for the statue design if anything. I mean, I was trying to at least somewhat consider what this statue would be, and what would let this statue stay standing and supported, especially if it is meant to be something older. I won't say that this is why I went with the skirt. It wasn't the main reason, but it was definitely at least part of the decision. If I remember correctly, the sketch is an iteration of a character design for one of my worlds and the related stories that occur within it, and the skirt had some extra markings on it that connected to the character's background and related areas. This wasn't the final design since it lacked a few things I wanted for that character in particular, and there were certainly at least a few other versions of them that came later to really polish it all off. Yet this version of it wasn't entirely wrong and unusable for other things like this. The skirt helps make it believable that the statue is standing when paired with the wings, which also made it rather appealing as a decision. Then the top and the bodice had really been something generic that fit into the world that would also be reasonably portrayed in stone. I mean, I know sculptors can likely do more complicated things in stone, and I have seen some statues that are impressively complicated or remarkable to look at. I mean, I've seen some where people have carved nets from stone, and some have made the material somehow look transparent in some statues before. Yet, this time I was aiming to make this look like a statue that would withstand time, to maybe make it seem older in the narratives area, and just so I wanted something that looked like it wouldn't crumble so simply. Even if it wasn't going to be old, I wanted it to look like it was meant to last. Or at the very least, I wanted it to make it look balanced, especially since the wings would be quite heavy if they were carved. Maybe here the weakest points are the wings, if anything, yet I was willing to do that. Now, in the sketch I did also add some details to the side of the skirt that I chose not to include in the later portion of the drawing and the video when it came to sketching and the flat colours. It really came down to the fact that I didn't like those details anymore and they didn't look right. They were a series of lines and circles that went up the side of the skirt and like the opening panel in the front. The details weren't adding anything, and they tied to the character that this wasn't supposed to be. This character just lacked the context for those designs to actually add anything, instead of distracting the eye. I considered it, I really did, but they were one of the last things I added to the sketch, as I wasn't sold on them even then, which meant it kind of made a little bit more sense to just skip it in most parts of the process. I figured that if I wanted to, I could always add them later, and at the end without much hassle, and I could make up my mind on them then. Yet, ultimately, I finished it, and I didn't feel like it was missing anything, and I didn't exactly see the need for them at that stage. So they weren't added, and I kept the whole dress pretty simple. Again, it worked in my favour. A simple dress kind of lets the rest of the details stand out that little bit more, and it gives me more room to work with when trying to make them the important part. For example, if the dress was overdone, the red wouldn't stand out on the belt, and the golden details may have also been more obscured by the lines in the detail behind it. Not to mention that the details on the dress would have been carved into the stone, so I would have had to make it look like that and to come across like stone instead of textured fabric, and that would have just made it all look way too busy visually. Speaking of those other details, let's look at them next for the statue. I mean, it is quite clearly a statue as well. The greys and the overall outcome and the shading kind of cement that quite well, I do believe. And, I mean, yes, it is mostly grey, but I also added hints of colour to it to make it kind of convey that it might have once been painted, or to further add hints of the person into it. I mean, it also worked well because the subtle greens could imply moss and plant as well, so that again could add to the time thing. Or again, it could also be read as paint, and there's kind of all sorts of ways that the little touches of colour add into it, but it doesn't take away from it being a statue. It also really doesn't take away from the other details to it, and the gold and the red. I mean, I kind of figured that the red on the belt would maybe be jewels set into the stone as an accent to the statue overall. If it is divine, then it makes sense that someone would add fancier details to it, or would put things of value to adorn the statue too. If it then is important and respected, it maybe makes sense why no one took it after. The yellow was then the same logic, just intended to be gold instead. They are meant to resemble golden accessories that people hung to adorn the statue, as if it was sort of an appeasement or an offering as well. It too could be a mark of respect. These details were interesting. I considered maybe tarnishing these as well, giving them a sign of age. I thought maybe to remove a stone from the belt like it fell or was taken out. I maybe could have added some sort of break to the gold elements as if it was broken over time and had grown weak. Yet I figured that it would come across more divine if it was all intact. And this was at a point where I was working with the first narrative where it was meant to be like a reincarnation of a divine, though it also added a lot to the other stories in the same vein. It would be more complete, and I know that I go on about this, but depending on how it would be viewed, it built up more of every single story that I was seeing in it. Something broken down would show time, perhaps. But that would be about it, and it would kind of push every story and interpretation towards the time route. With it being complete, then it could be newer, kept and cared for, or simply magic. It really was something that was up to the viewer, and that's why I kept these details how I did. These details were also important to tie the characters together. I chose to draw the character from behind, the person at the front, and that was really done so that we don't see their face, and really look at the hair and the back of the character instead. It's why, when I was adding the details to the person at the front, I added the golden belt from the statue, as it mirrors those on both parts almost perfectly. The only situation is that I didn't want to copy it all in its entirety. It's why the redstone belt isn't present, and instead for one of the golden chains as a belt. And it's also why they don't have the ones on their shoulders, yet the gold chain on the waist is the same. I then also wanted to share the same flower details on both of them. Just to speak briefly on this aspect, the only other thing between the pair that the person lacks is the wings of the statue. This is more to make the person appear more mortal or in disguise, just to add more to the narrative overall. From a drawing standpoint, the wings on the statue add presence to that section of the piece and draws the eyes upwards to everything. They're spread and you can't help but notice them. In a way, it is the wings that make it a focal point, and the main focal point overall. For the person, they're meant to blend in, and they're meant to kind of be part of the environment more than anything. The wings would contrast a lot, and it would obscure most of the foreground, and it would mean that I would lack all of the details and the things around them there. I also wouldn't be able to add in the details like the chain, or anything that really cemented the character as the statue. And it's why I chose not to give them to the person at the end of the day. I considered it, I looked at it, and there are sketches where the person does have wings at the front. But they were all weaker, and they just kind of didn't look right, and things were fighting for attention. So, saying that, there is one detail of the statue left, and that is the flowers across their person and the bouquet in their hands. Ironically, this was a detail I decided on with the environment around them more than anything. See, I wasn't sure at first what the character's theme would be, so I had been deciding to work out the environment around the statue before settling on anything strictly for the statue's importance. If they had been in a ruined temple, it could have been something darker like death, and the statue is abandoned by that and the negative connections that they'd carry. If it was a natural waterfall and lakes, water would have been a good theme to look at and consider exploring for the statue. Instead, I settled on the bushes and the overgrown element of everything that meant I wanted to tie these flowers into the statue, and kind of tie them into nature before anything else. It added interest too. The flowers seem fresh and chosen specifically. They're all uniform colours and the same type of flower across the entire drawing, which is also shared by the person. Yet they're not a random mix of colours, and the petals or types of flowers that look as if they're grown or beyond control. They don't look wild, they don't look like they're not meant to be there. If they weren't meant to be there, then you'd have a blue flower, a red flower, and all sorts that would make it less coherent. I look at it as if the flowers could be part of someone keeping the statue out of respect. Them being in bloom, and blooming flowers, implies someone might have been replacing them across time, and that someone cares enough to ensure that they're not allowed to wither or wilt. Otherwise, in some versions of the story, the magic of the statue could be what keeps these flowers new and blooming. And this one all sorts of leans towards the idea that the statue is of divinity more than anything. Either way, and regardless of this fact, it was also just a strong way to tie the two together as well, as it really is one of the more obvious things that they share. Both of them wear the flower crowns, both of them wear the bracelets, and it is something that's more noticeable than anything else that I've added. But that does cover everything in terms of the character and the statue though. So let's talk about the environment then. The first thing I want to mention is actually the pillars to either side. They are a detail that I wasn't so sure of on what I would want to do there and what I would end up doing there, And then I tried out of curiosity more than anything definitive that ended up getting to stay as I liked it the way that it framed the image. And they do work quite well to frame everything and to give it that bit more of a presence. The plants over them were done as I kind of wanted to blend them into everything that little bit more, as they were standing out way too much at the beginning and the start of everything. But in saying that, it also gave something for the vines in the foreground to feasibly hang off something in the outcome too. These were very simple details. They didn't take long to include at all, yet it also furthered the impression that there is something around the statue that isn't just abandoned in the middle of a forest. There's something keeping it. These arches still stand, and the plants are a feature to it as well, rather than just something to show that no one's cared for this anymore. It was also interesting to look at it in terms of scale. I mean, I know I drew the person pretty small for the environment, but that was somewhat intended. I mean, given the size of the steps, pillars, and the statue themselves, things are a little bit larger than they would typically need or are intended to be. Though I realised this and figured that it could be quite interesting to continue with it. Maybe everything is the scale of the statue, rather than what a person would need, and that again adds layers to things. The steps may be steep, yet not for the statue. The pillars are tall, but again, they fit the statue if anything, and it helps draw the eye towards that before anything else. I would also say that it isn't completely unfeasible that the environment would work for a person, so that is kind of why I went with it. My reasoning for all of this is that it would be built around the main creation though. Perhaps the case is that the statue is supposed to be an accurate scale of whatever it depicts, so the space had to be built for them. Maybe it would be a thing that the followers choose to do when building something out of a sign of respect. The stairs are steep, but not impossible to climb or anything, and it really is another detail that's up to interpretation. Of course, having that frame and the view established, I had to have inside of it done and the environment around the figure. It is then equally as important to everything else that I would be looking at after all, and it could have ruined the outcome if I'd gotten the environment wrong or didn't give it the consideration it needed. And this, ironically, despite being one of the last things we speak about here, was one of the first things that I considered. I first thought that I would make the environment something like a temple. I considered rows of columns, stone floors, and offerings laid out in front of the statue as we would expect. Yet I then realised in the sketching phase that I'd already taken some inspiration from the fantasy world that I created, and I could do a little bit with the ideas from it to keep things interesting, and not like something that I've made before. I mean, I don't know at this moment if this would ever tie into that world or the project, but it was certainly part of the inspiration and did kind of push me away from the comfort of what we know, and almost inspired me to do something that you wouldn't really expect or think of straight away. That world is magic. The character would be tied to plants. So when I was testing how this would look and came to the conclusion that I would include the environment somewhere in this image, I thought about how there could be a belief around the statue that things of nature and the environment around them could be a form of appeasement or a sign of respect and acknowledgement. If they are connected to nature, then surround them with nature. And that made at least a little bit of sense to me. So I tied in the bushes by this logic before moving to include the flowers, yet it also worked out surprisingly well. It was different to my usual ideas and it came together quite well. My other option for reading the environment I went with was that, maybe, the plants and bushes are overgrown details. The flowers not so much as they are controlled, yet the bushes might be something unwanted as the stairs are somewhat eroding and the plants are claiming them a little bit. If this is the case, it points more towards the magic route and the statue's condition, which I rather enjoyed as it again served to add layers to the story that I'm suggesting. And again though, it's something you can kind of pick and choose to how you read it. The only issue I could have had with it was maybe how plain the plants were in the sketching. They just felt empty compared to everything else around it, and I wanted to somehow tie something into it that would just wrap it all up and give it some interest as well. Something to look at almost. I also knew I wanted to include candles in the sketching point, and I didn't want just one or two at the foot of the statue on their own. This is then where I tied in the lights to the bushes. Is it a fire hazard? Yes, absolutely. I do not doubt that by our logic, this scene would have caught fire ages ago. Do they look good? Yes, and so they will stay despite any fire hazards that may be present. Maybe this world just doesn't have that sort of risk. Besides, they are all also newly burning candles, which furthered everything that I've spoken about so far up to now, that it was almost too perfect to remove them. Someone has either left the candles as new offerings, replaced or removed the old ones, or there is some sort of magic keeping them all together, or some other secret option that I haven't thought of. It brings them all together, and it gave me part of the palette as well, that I simply couldn't ignore or remove them all. So then that brings us towards the end of today's video. Overall, I really enjoyed this drawing process, and it was certainly fun to just explore something like this again between other projects at the moment. I didn't have too many problems with it, and the outcome is just something fun that I've wanted to make for longer than I've realised with how repetitive the idea has been, and how many times have I sketched something like this. Not to mention the fact that it's also given me a range of other stories and ideas along the way that I can always explore as I need to and when I want to. All of that being said though, I certainly hope that you've enjoyed this video as much as I've enjoyed making it. If you do have a fun interpretation of the story, be sure to let me know, as that is always part of the fun for these drawings and something I really enjoy seeing. Someone can read it entirely different to another person and myself, and I can never predict the ways that everyone will view it. For now though, have a wonderful day and I will see you all next time. Goodbye!